which is really the purpose statement for the Gospel of Mark. It fits right on after 1 to 12. Of course, Jesus, we have another call. Jesus is by the seaside again. And he calls this time, goodness gracious, 4 fishermen, 4 common people. That was okay. Maybe admirable to reach out to common people, but now he calls a despicable tax collector to follow him. And then the tax collector's friends all come and they follow him. There's a whole house full, and he's eating with them. And man, are the Pharisees mad now. They're peeking in the door, asking his disciples, what's he doing with those people? And of course, then we have Jesus' statement, I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. What he means is, of course, as we've been studying in that passage, I didn't come to call those who think they're good enough, but those who know and acknowledge their sins so that they will embrace the salvation that I have brought. So it is a slap in the face to any of us religious people who think we're good enough. If you want Jesus, you've got to get rid of that. And this is his purpose statement. Then, of course, it goes on in 3:1 to 6 when he heals the hand on the Sabbath day, the man with the withered hand in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Of course, you see, the whole conflict of Jesus and the Sabbath is it's in a different light. We tend to look at it in other lights about what we should do on the Sabbath day or what have you. The whole point is Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath because God is the Lord of the Sabbath. I mean, it's a clear claim to his own divine authority. And so there you have the Pharisees and the Herodians. Now, we're not sure who the Herodians are, but these are opposite poles. This is further apart than the Republicans and the communists. I mean, you know, this is arch enemies. They're agreeing on one thing. Maybe they couldn't agree on a budget either. I don't know. They're agreeing. By the way, we had a little celebration. Carl, the new registrar, and I in the office when the government shut down because we got a letter. There are reports to the government, statistical reports. And we were under the gun to get them ready, and we got a letter that said every day the government was closed, the deadline was put off by 1 day. So that took the pressure off of Carl and me. So we had a little celebration. but Jesus then, they are determined to get rid of him because he's in their face with divine authority, and they don't want to admit it. We see them later on in chapter 3, they come up with the idea that, well, the absurd idea that he's got to do this by the power of the devil. It's like, you are crazy. You are absolutely crazy. Here's a person who exercises such total authority, for whom there is no self-interest. He's not doing anything for himself. He's not making any money. He's not doing anything, building up his own nest in any way, shape, or form. And you claim that he's doing this by the power of the devil. But that's, of course, the only thing they can say, because, well, his family just thinks he's out of his mind, but beside himself. But anyway, so 1:3 to 6, this is the invitation. It begins with the invitation to the 4. Then it clarifies what that invitation is right in the center here with the call of Levi and Jesus' authority to forgive sins. It's the invitation to you and me as readers of the gospel to follow, to be like the 4 and like Levi, and to follow. Now, assuming you do, we move to the next stage. Now, Jesus calls the 12, and this next stage in the gospel is when those who have begun to believe are now with Jesus to see more of his power and more of what he is like. There's a lot of, what is revealed here is, the crowds don't see much of it. It's the disciples who now see it. The next stage, we'll see that Jesus' disciples are actually involved in his ministry, by beginning with helping to feed the 5,000 and so forth. But this one, they're chosen to be with him. So it's like, you are following. Come see. That's in the Gospel of John, of course, where Jesus told those disciples of John the Baptist, and they said, where do you live? Come and see. But here, the implications. You've begun to follow like those disciples. Step further, let's see. He chooses the 12 to be with him and to send them out to be with him in this section. Now, in this section, it begins, there's the controversy over who Jesus is. We have, after he appoints those disciples, immediately in chapter 3, you have his family thinking he's out of his head. And then you have the scribes from Jerusalem. They've come up with their official fatwa on Jesus, that he's, he's doing all this by the absurd thing, by the power of the devil. And then you have his family again, and you have Jesus clarifying discipleship. Where somebody says, he looks around and he says, they say your mother and your sisters, your brother are looking for you, and he looks around and says, who is my mother? Or my brothers or my sisters? So as they hear the word of God and do it, he clarifies, it's not, he's certainly not doing this by the power of the devil, but neither does it make you a disciple just because you're blood relation to Jesus. Whoever your mama was and whoever your daddy was, and whatever group you belong to is not what makes you a disciple. Till you hear the word of God and do it. So, and then we move with it. The parables, of course, are about the sower and about the seed. They're parables of hearing. And the question of the parable of the soil and of the other parables there is, will you hear? Do you hear? Yes. And of course, most of us who've begun to follow Jesus would say what this parable means, just like what the disciples said. And Jesus says, hey, don't you understand parables? And then he explains it to them. He's explaining it to his disciples. He's inviting us to come in. He's inviting us to be good soil, to hear, to follow, to accept the word of the kingdom. And then, as this section goes on, the disciples are shown his power in a way that the crowds have not seen it. They've seen some pretty great things. But here at the end of chapter 4, Jesus is crossing the sea. And they're in the great storm. And of course he does his peace be still thing. And you can imagine when they arrived at today's lesson on the shore of Gennesaret, on the opposite of the Sea of Galilee, coming through that storm, there was still a trembling. Not just a trembling at fear of the storm, but an awesome, a sense of awe at what Jesus had just done. And they're in a strange place, and you can almost feel like the hair standing up the back of their neck still as they step ashore. And where in the world are they on the other side of the sea? Well, it's called Gennesaret. Some of the Gospels label it differently. And you know what? The geographers don't know really where it is. Somebody was talking about being in Palestine, and they'd been shown where it was and all that stuff. And I didn't say this out loud, but I thought, tourist claptrap. Nobody knows for sure where Gennesaret was. And the gospel writers seem to be even a little vague about it. And I think that's intentional. Because this is intentional. This is kind of like what sociologists would call a liminal experience. The disciples have been taken out of their normal, this ain't their normal world, man. They've pulled out of the normal world of everyday life. They are in Gentile territory. They are in unclean territory. It's a cemetery. It's unclean for any Jew. It's infested with pigs. Now, I'm glad I live under the new covenant. I like my ham, and I like my sausage really well. And, it's quite obvious I like a lot of things. But anyway, but the pigs designated this place showed how unclean this place was. And here you have this uncontrolled demoniac. I mean, this is out of their world. But you remember what's going on here. Jesus is revealing to them the grandeur of his power, of who he is. In other words, if you really want to know who Jesus is, yes, he invites you, he shows you, but then when you follow, you will know more. And that's what's happening to the disciples. They're having a greater revelation of Jesus' power. First of all, in the storm. Second of all, here. And then, in the woman with the issue of blood, and then Jairus' daughter. And then that comes to the end of this section. Now, what you need to realize is, see, all of these are more or less private miracles for the disciples. Certainly the calming of the sea, nobody else saw that. Now, the thing that happens here with the demoniac, there weren't any Jewish people around. The only people around were the people herding those pigs. They certainly weren't Jews. A few of them. The woman with the issue of blood, it was so private, nobody knew it happened to start with. When Jesus said, "Who touched me?" Peter said, "Jesus. There's a crowd. We're all bumping each other. What do you mean, who touched you?" Only she then and the disciples really knew that. And of course, he shooed everybody out of Jairus' house when he went in and raised Jairus. But see, here, as his disciples, they're seeing his power to still the storm. The mighty power of nature to cast out a legion of demons. And finally to raise the dead. So that's what's going on here. So when we come to today, this is place. And they're supposed to write for their assignment a paragraph describing the place, today's assignment, describing the place of this passage. And so to summarize, I'm cheating because I would normally make you tell me what you had written for this part, but I've gone ahead and I'm telling this part, but you're going to get to talk some of the rest of it. But I'll be a little easy on you today in light of all the guests we have. But now after saying all that, I lost my place. We see that for the place of this passage, if we want to understand it, we need to understand that it is in this section where Jesus has brought the disciples with him. It is in the section where he is demonstrating his power to them in a deeper way than he did it publicly. And it follows then this demonstration of calming the storm and precedes what's going to happen with the woman with the issue of blood and the healing of the raising of Jairus' daughter to life. The woman with the issue of blood is kind of tacked in there, but it's of course not insignificant. It's a very important incident when you realize that the unstenched menstrual flow, which is probably what it was, made her perpetually unclean. Anything she sat on or touched, anybody else who touched it became unclean. For those 12 years, she'd never been to the synagogue or the temple because she could not go. She was cut out. And but Jesus touched her, or she touched Jesus even, and that face, she was made clean. It's very significant there. But the focus on today, then, you see, understanding the place. The reason I emphasize this is understanding the place helps us to interpret this passage, to show us what we're looking for, and also to see its full meaning in what it is doing to make us disciples. Are you with me so far? Yes. Now, the thing we're actually focusing on today is plan. Place, plan, particulars, and point are the 4 steps. Plan is when, if you had inductive Bible study online, they talked about, and we talked about structural laws. I talk about structural relationships, how things fit together. This is structural analysis. But I don't just tell people to go to the passage and list all the structural relationships they see. This is where it's different than some other people do it. Because my experience with students is when you do that, you'll get a bunch of insights. But often there's no proportion. People don't see don't separate what are the main structural relationships from lesser ones. So, the first is, is to look at this 5, 1 to 20. It's a long passage, so it's difficult to not have trouble working on 2 screens.
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, so they're in the tombs, they're with pigs, they're in unclean territory. That makes them unclean. What do they have to do to get clean? Because I know there's a whole bunch of ceremonies.
I don't want to just put it off, Peter, John, but I think you're asking the wrong question to begin with. Remember, the questions that, the primary questions in the Gospels, first of all, are who is Jesus, and then what does it mean to be a disciple? Now, when you say what do they have to do to be clean, I assume you're talking about the demoniac?
No, the disciples who are in the cemetery, which is unclean, with the pigs that are unclean.
The text is not even concerned about that.
I know, but in a Jewish tradition, what would like the woman with the blood, she was unclean, and apparently she was bumping across a whole bunch of people in the crowd, which makes them unclean. And if they're unclean because they touched her, and they're bumping everybody else, how do they?
Okay, it's not a bad question in itself, but it is not a question that will help you in the study of this text at all. Because if you read Trina, he's pretty strong on the fact that the questions, not just the answers, but the questions need to arise from the text. If a text is not addressing a question, to ask it of the text is useless as far as interpreting the text. It may well lead to misinterpretation. You know, there's nothing in this text talking about what other people had to do to be made clean. There's nothing in this text that's talking about if, okay, the disciples came into a graveyard so they're unclean, what they had to do. The point of the text is who Jesus is and what it means to follow him. And I will be giving part of the passage away, but you know, so when we know this, then I'm jumping ahead even to particulars, which is the study of terms. What you're going to do is, in studying the terms here, what we already understand about the passage helps us. Because what we do in studying the terms here is to say, okay, how do they show us the power of Jesus? So, when we study the terms for next week, we're going to look at certain terms. A certain set of terms will show us how bad this situation is. How ungodly. How outside the realm of God's people it is. How much bondage this guy is under. And then there's a whole other set of complementary terms that show how great Jesus' power was over all this. If you want to put it in terms of uncleanness, ultimately this passage shows when Jesus comes, uncleanness flees. It's gone. You know, if you and I had touched a leper in those days, we would have become unclean. When Jesus touched the leper became clean. You know, so if you want to put it in terms of uncleanness, where Jesus is, uncleanness it goes. You know, and this is apart from Mark, but that's a helpful analogy for me for the incarnation. Jesus did not assume an idealized humanity. He didn't assume human nature as Adam had it, because Adam hadn't fallen. Jesus assumed our broken human nature. But just as when he was on earth, he touched a leper and they became clean, he did not become unclean. So when he assumed that human nature of ours, by assuming it, he takes it in hand and makes it clean, if you will. But, you know, the text is not concerned about whether disciples became unclean or not, or what happened to them, or the other people in that group. It's concerned about who Jesus is and what it means to follow him. So it's important. Other questions may be interesting, they may have their place, but if they don't relate to what the text is actually dealing with, We had an example of that in what I was talking to him about before you came. We were talking about the terms in 2:13 through 17, where the Pharisees poke their heads in and say, why is Jesus eating with sinners? It's so easy for us to get talking about the legalism of the Pharisees, because we've learned it from Sunday school, and there are other passages which talk about it. Their legalism and the difference between outward righteousness and inward righteousness. But that really doesn't help you in 2:13 through 17 very much. Because the whole point is simply, it's not that they were legalist or anything else. The whole point is simply, they didn't think they needed Jesus. And those poor, wretched tax collectors and sinners sitting there, they knew what they needed. And so the whole point of the passage is smack you in the face until you come to Jesus, until you come to the place that you know you need him. He hasn't come for you. When you come to that place, he's come for you. So, anyway, now the plan, so the first thing with plan is to ask the first question. We don't just go and look for structural relationships. The first question is to divide this passage into what its main parts are. Okay. Can you help me, any class? I know you're down from 5 to 3. Your troops are low today, but where did you divide this? What's some of the main sections? Let's read this passage so we get it before. Mark 5, 1 to 20. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when Jesus saw him, from afar, he, that is the demoniac, ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. For he was saying to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And Jesus asked him, what is your name? He replied, my name is Legion, for we are many. And he begged them earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. And they begged him, saying, send us to the pigs, let us into them. So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country. And people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with the demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim into the capitals how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. All right. Where did you guys divide this? Into main sections. Where's the first division?
Verses 13 and 14. And after divisions,
Well, 13 and 14. Yep, 13 and 14. And that is certainly a natural division. What makes the division here between 13 and 14?
We have an introduction of new people, new characters.
Okay.
And we also have the introduction of opposition from these characters.
Good. You know, when we're looking for differences, we look for changes in persons, places, people, events, and ideas. And also introductory and concluding phrases. This is obviously within this passage. I mean, it all goes together. It's all about the Jesus casting this legion out of the demoniac. It all goes together. But there is a division here. We have the herds. The herdsmen no doubt have been there, but they haven't been introduced till here. And then we have other people coming. And, of course, the whole thing, 14 to the end, is up until 13, it's been the situation in Jesus Acts. 14 till the end, what is it talking about?
People in the city wanted to expel and leave, and then it also talks about the desire of the money and once possessed man to follow him.
Okay, so we have, but here, the whole 14 and following is reaction to what Jesus has done. Varying reactions. You have the herdsmen who run away to bring the people in, and their reaction. And of course, they want Jesus to, they beg Jesus to go. You know, why do you suppose they're begging Jesus to go?
I think I know. Because you have 2,000 pigs that have now infested your waters that you go daily to draw upon, to drink. You now have no water, and it's going to be almost immediate that it's going to infect you and your family. Not only did you lose a lot of money and your herds, but now you have no water to drink.
Well, that may well be true. I don't know if they came here and drew water or not. Maybe they did. But it may well be true. And certainly the other part of what you said is true. You know, this is a big economic investment. It's gone. And of course the herdsmen hightail it in because they're responsible. So they want people to know. So, you know, they're scared of Jesus. You know, we just lost all this investment. What's he going to do next? You know, is he going to blow up the house next? Is he going to get rid of the cows next? Is he going to curse the wheat field next? And so to them he's kind of like some powerful magician who's coming here, and they're scared of him. So but the division here is because here you have reaction to Jesus, to what Jesus has done. Okay, if we were going to divide 1 through 13, where would we put it?
I had a 1 through 5 is like a preparation for healing or the miracle of the demoniac, because it introduces the place and the person and also his condition. And then verses 6 through 13 indicate a turning point where Jesus engages the legion and casts out the legion, verse 8. So verses 1 through 5 are